Hey guys, tonight we will dive deep into the dark corners of history to uncover only 10 of the most repulsive things King Henry VIII ever did. Just 10, not all of them, but each one is chilling. He is not only famous for his 6 wives and the breakaway from the Catholic Church, but also a master of brutality and intrigue, from secretly purging his closest courtiers to delivering savage death sentences. Is it purely a lust for power, or does it hide a complex, deeply unstable psyche? We will together reveal the most horrifying secrets of this legendary king. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please comment below to let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The most repulsive thing, number 1. Eltham Ordinances, the secret reshuffle of 1526, 1526. In the drowsy hush of the Tudor palace, let us drift on the gentle breeze of the night and listen to the tale of the Eltham Ordinances, one of King Henry VIII's most repulsive schemes. At first glance, the Eltham Ordinances appeared as a simple effort to reorganize the royal household for greater ease, aimed at cutting court expenses and streamlining finances. Yet behind that courteous veil lay a weapon of power so vicious that the king used it to sabotage his own wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess. In the year 1526, Henry VIII commissioned the drafting of 11 ordinances governing personnel and expenditures in the court, from limiting the number of musicians in the royal band to strictly regulating how many servants could surround the queen and auditing every penny spent. The meetings at Eltham Palace echoed with the soft rustle of papers and promises of greater efficiency, more savings. Yet the very first ordinance ruthlessly ordered the reduction of Catherine's Spanish retinue. These attendants had been the living symbols of the Queen's influence, proof of the relatively strong diplomatic ties between England and the Kingdom of Spain. Before the Eltham Ordinances appeared, Queen Catherine strode confidently by Henry's side, flanked by a formidable procession of courtiers, sometimes numbering dozens of servants and guards bearing the cultural marks of Spain in their language, rituals, and fashion. Their presence not only earned her profound respect, but also boosted her political standing at court. Yet, after 23 years of marriage, Henry's heart grew cold, and his gaze shifted toward Anne Boleyn, rendering Catherine expendable. Thus, under the guise of restructuring the household, the king quietly ordered the reduction of Catherine's staff and rigorously sealed off her budget. Every decorative object, every velvet drape in the Queen's chambers fell silent. Catherine's precious gemstones, porcelain sets, even her cherished jewellery was suddenly deemed excessive expenses and subjected to harsh inspection. Her once loyal courtiers bowed their heads and departed one by one. The Queen, who had once shone like a goddess, was forced into a lonely corner, left only with silent silks that sighed in the wind. Her reputation and dignity, built over years of diplomacy and devotion, shook to their core. What is most striking about the Eltham Ordinances is how the pretense of savings became a hidden blade. Henry used the pretext of spending less to strip away every pillar of the Queen's power. It was no dry administrative reform, but the opening salvo of a marital storm, paving the way for one of history's most infamous annulments. Catherine may have believed she was merely undergoing a protocol adjustment, but Henry was clandestinely prying loose every nail that anchored her to her throne. Amid hurried meetings, personnel lists were retyped, old drafts destroyed, the clack of typewriter keys and smell of fresh ink on parchment foreshadowing the end of the Queen's glory. When the Eltham Ordinances were finally published, the court whispered in unnerved tones. The king's power no longer lay solely in his crown. Now anyone who supported the Queen could be saved away without mercy. Henceforth, the question was not, what will he do, but who will he spare? This brutal policy marked the beginning of sweeping personnel changes. Not only did Catherine lose her backing, but even the most steadfast officials in her service faced purge. Simultaneously, the Eltham Ordinances sowed seeds for the religious upheavals to come, igniting the clash between the Church of England and Rome, proving Henry ready to sacrifice anyone, even his wife, to achieve his ultimate goal, absolute power. And so, with the clink of an afternoon teacup and the soft yawns of exhausted courtiers, The Eltham Ordinances quietly inscribed a dark chapter where no cries were heard, only a terrifying silence. For though Henry VIII wielded life and death authority, posterity would learn that cunning intrigue need not burst forth in flaming battles to be fearsome. Sometimes a silent decree suffices to vanquish both a queen and the most loyal hearts. Thus, the Tudor night crept ever closer, leaving only the doleful sighs of the abandoned. Asterisk. Asterisk. The Most Repulsive Thing number 2, Saint Maid of Kent, Elizabeth Barton, and the Power of Prophecy, 1530, 3 to 1534. In the soft, drowsy hush of early dawn, carry your thoughts gently back to the village of Aldington, where unassuming Elizabeth Barton first claimed she heard heavenly voices. Known later as the Saint Maid of Kent, Barton emerged in 1533 as a quiet, pious woman living alone, tending simple prayers and the humble tasks of rural life. She spoke little of politics at first, sharing only vague warnings of coming troubles, whispers of storms on the horizon, or shadows nearing the throne, all delivered in tones so earnest and trembling that neighbouring villagers listened with hushed reverence. At the time, such mysterious utterances might have seemed harmless, the ramblings of a devout soul seeking meaning in uncertain times. But gravity settled upon her words when Henry VIII moved, in 1534, to end his marriage with Queen Catherine of Aragon and wed Anne Boleyn. It was then that Elizabeth's prophecies sharpened from gentle caution into bold denunciations of royal will. Elizabeth intoned that Henry's divorce was nothing less than sacrilege, a direct violation of divine ordinance. She prophesied that if the king persisted in breaking from the Catholic Church, his lineage and crown would be cast into ruin. These declarations struck a chord throughout England's conservative circles among abbots in cloistered monasteries, dowager countesses in opulent manors, and farmers who still clung to vestiges of medieval piety. Rumours spread like wildfire. Travellers returning from Canterbury spoke of seeing Elizabeth perched by candlelight in a small hovel, reading from tattered manuscripts and issuing vision-laden speeches to crowds who came miles to hear her. Some claimed she wept tears of blood, as she predicted war and plague. Others swore her voice grew icy when describing the king's fate. Her reputation blossomed overnight, and with it a fervent following of émigré priests, disgruntled nobles, and commoners alike. Yet what electrified the court was not merely the content of her prophecies, but the startling breadth of her influence. Noblemen discreetly dispatched emissaries to measure her sincerity, while high-ranking churchmen debated whether her visions were divine or diabolical. Accounts tell of secret meetings in shadowed corridors of Whitehall, where courtiers pressed one another for whispered updates. Had Elizabeth named specific dates? Had she invoked saints by name? The answers only energized her following. Even envoys from foreign powers took note, recognizing in Elizabeth's words a rallying cry against Henry's sweeping religious reforms. To the king's inner circle, this was no trivial mysticism. It was potential sedition, a catalyst for rebellion that threatened to unite resistant factions under a banner of divine protest. Alarmed, Henry resolved to eliminate this threat. In a move that mirrored the most ruthless sections of his newly declared Supremacy Act, he ordered Elizabeth's arrest. Agents arrived one moonless night at her cottage, seizing her with scant explanation. She was conveyed to the Tower of London beneath iron barrows, her fate sealed before the ink dried on new warrants. There, in damp cells where torches sputtered and rats skittered, Elizabeth endured days of interrogation. The king's commissioners, stern bishops and hawkish privy councillors, pressed her to confess that her visions were fabrications. Some records hint at coercion. Pained cries echoed through the corridors, chains were tightened, and cries for mercy fell on unheeding ears. Eventually, Elizabeth signed a confession under duress, swearing she had conjured her prophecies to gain fame. But even that damaged redemption could not save her. On a bleak morning in 1534, Elizabeth Barton was paraded through the silent streets of London to the execution scaffold. Dressed in her grey habit, she stood quaking beneath the guards' cruel jeers, her frail frame dwarfed by the block awaiting her. As the axe fell, a hush devoured the crowd. Some fled in horror, others wept at the sight of her blood staining the cold stone. Thus perished the Saint Maid of Kent, accused of high treason simply for daring to claim God spoke through her. Her demise reverberated far beyond that stark scaffold, In taverns and market squares, her followers clutched tattered scraps of her spoken words, sharing them in secret gatherings. Some recast her as a martyr, persecuted for her piety. Others boasted of Henry's decisive might, warning that no mortal, even a vessel of divine will, could withstand the king's wrath. The episode signaled a chilling message. Challenge Henry's authority at your peril, and divine sanction offered no sanctuary against royal decree. In the end, Elizabeth Barton's story stands as the second of our 10 most repulsive tales, a vivid testament to how far Henry VIII would go to quash perceived disloyalty. He silenced a woman whose only crime was proclaiming visions of heaven, demonstrating that under his reign, no voice, however hallowed, could contradict his will without paying with her life. So rest easy as you drift towards slumber, remembering this dark chapter where prophecy and power clashed, leaving only echoes of a pious woman's desperate warning in the cold dawn of Tudor England. Asterisk, asterisk. The most repulsive thing, number 3. The Act of Supremacy. Henry's self-coronation as supreme head of the Church of England. 1534. In the soft, drowsy glow of dawn's first light, allow yourself to drift back to the year 1534, when King Henry VIII quietly shattered centuries of religious tradition with a single stroke of the pen. Known as the Act of Supremacy, this cunning statute proclaimed the monarch himself to be the supreme head of the Church of England, severing all allegiance to the Pope and the Roman Church. On the surface, it seemed a grand declaration of national independence, an assertion that England would henceforth guide its own spiritual destiny. Yet beneath that veneer lay one of the most repulsive consolidations of power in Tudor history, the fusion of crown and altar into a singular, unchallengeable authority. Henry VIII had long grown weary of ecclesiastical interference, especially when it blocked his bid to annul his marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Frustrated by papal refusals and desperate for a male heir, he seized upon the growing momentum for reformation across Europe. In Parliament's sleepy corridors, where debate often droned like distant waves, Henry's ministers slipped through the Act of Supremacy with little fanfare, presenting it as a logical reform to streamline church governance. And so, with the nod of a monarch accustomed to getting his way, England was declared a church led not by a distant pontiff in Rome, but by its own king in Westminster. The implications were staggering. Overnight, the spiritual landscape of England shifted like sand beneath an indifferent tide. Monasteries, once bastions of charity and learning, braced for scrutiny under a sovereign who could now depose abbots on a whim. Parish priests, taught for generations to look to Rome for guidance, were forced to swear an oath acknowledging Henry as their ultimate spiritual authority. Those deemed unreconciled faced the grim prospect of being branded traitors, an offence punishable not merely by loss of property, but by the grisly fate of execution, beheading in the public square, their blood a warning to any who might question the king's divine right. As the sleepy countryside stirred to the news, whispers spread through cloisters and cathedral aisles like a chill wind. "He has crowned himself without a crown," muttered some monks, their voices quivering as they packed away sacred vestments. Noble families of staunch Catholic heritage exchanged anxious glances at banquet tables, dreading the moment they would be called upon to swear fealty to a secular head of faith. Even devout laypeople paused in their morning prayers, uncertain whether the church to which they had committed their souls now stood under the gaze of temporal power rather than heavenly grace. In the hushed halls of Hampton Court, Henry basked in his triumph. The Act's passage cemented his personal ambition to wield both sword and crozier, to govern heart and mind alike. Bishops once confirmed by the Pope were now appointed at the king's pleasure, their loyalty swiftly tested by oaths that rang more like shackles than sacraments. Clerical resistance, though scattered, was met with ruthless efficiency. Recusant priests were stripped of their benefices, their estates seized to refill the royal coffers drained by Henry's extravagant lifestyle. Some were imprisoned in dank towers, others forced into exile, their voices silenced so that no psalm or sermon might contradict the will of the crown. Dreamily, one might imagine a hushed, candlelit trial, with trembling judges reciting the king's edict as though it were divine law. The very foundations of faith, centuries of papal decrees, creeds, and councils, were overturned in a matter of weeks, replaced by a single statute that conferred upon one man the power to absolve sins, appoint clerics, and define the boundaries of doctrine. It was an act so brazen that even the most indifferent observer could not help but shudder at its audacity. A monarch claiming the prerogatives of a pontiff, a kingdom subsumed beneath his sovereign will. By the time the sun rose high over London Bridge, England had begun its uneasy transformation. Parishioners knelt at altars now adorned with the king's seal. Choirs sang hymns that omitted references to St. Peter and the keys of heaven. The ancient rituals of confession and absolution were recast under royal authority, their priestly mediators made accountable to a secular throne. In this new order, every communion wafer, every ringing bell, carried the weight of Henry's judgment, and so the sleepy hush of 1534 gave way to an age of vigilant watchfulness. The Act of Supremacy had achieved its purpose, to place the full machinery of the Church under the control of one man. Yet in doing so, it had unleashed fear in countless hearts. Fear that their souls might be toyed with as easily as political subjects, and that the once inviolable sanctuary of faith was now subject to the whims of mortal power. Thus, in this third most repulsive of Henry's deeds, we see the chilling mechanics of religious conquest. Not by force of arms, but by the quiet stroke of royal decree, transforming the very nature of devotion into a matter of obedience to a king. Asterisk. The most repulsive thing, number 4, dissolution of the monasteries. The whirlwind from 1536 to 1540. 1. In a voice as soft as the rustle of parchment in an empty cloister, let us drift through the somnolent years spanning 1536 to 1541, when King Henry VIII unleashed the single greatest campaign of destruction ever seen in English religious history. Known simply as the dissolution of the monasteries, this sweeping edict commanded the closure of over 800 monastic houses, abbeys, and priories scattered across the realm. These venerable institutions, repositories of ancient manuscripts, sacred art, and untold religious treasures, were stripped bare, their riches redirected into the vast coffers of the crown. The driving force behind this monstrous upheaval was, above all, greed. Monasteries had flourished for centuries on generous endowments of land, donations from pious benefactors, and the steady flow of alms intended to feed the poor. To Henry, awash in debts incurred by his quest for a male heir, costly wars, and extravagant courtly splendor, these holdings represented a treasure trove he could not ignore. Armed soldiers and civilian laborers fanned out across the countryside, dismantling stone walls, hauling away illuminated manuscripts, stained glass windows, and golden chalices once kissed by pilgrims' lips. Whole libraries vanished in the clatter of carts, while armories of silver plate and gilded vestments passed into royal possession. As each monastery fell, its inhabitants, brothers and sisters, who had spent their lives in prayer and service, found themselves cast into uncertainty. Some received meagre pensions, most were left to wander the roads, begging for shelter or digging odd jobs to survive. The local economy felt the shock waves in every village. Markets once buoyed by pilgrims' trade grew silent. Agricultural lands, long managed by monastic overseers, lay fallow without guidance. The charitable services once provided by these communities, meals for the needy, care for the sick, education for children, halted abruptly, leaving many of the poorest bereft of support and comfort. In sleepy market towns, former monks and nuns appeared as forlorn figures in tattered habits, their eyes vacant from the rupture of centuries-old routines. The very social fabric of rural England frayed under the loss. Feast days faded from memory, local festivals dwindled, and the sense of stability nurtured by monastic presence eroded. Parish priests, who had collaborated reluctantly in the closures, whispered apologies to mourners at dusty altars. They, too, felt the guilt of having witnessed the dismantling of places where countless souls once sought solace. Between the crumbling pillars of Fountains Abbey, once echoing with solemn chants, and the empty cloisters of Repulsive, where stained glass had once danced with sunrise, the dissolution left a landscape of ruin and despair. England's spiritual heart, long anchored in the rhythm of the monastic day matins, lauds, terce, sext, nun, vespers, Compline stuttered to a halt as bells fell silent and recesses were boarded over. Travellers later recounted the eerie sight of rotting timbers and torn vestments, relics of a lively faith reduced to rooks of debris. Yet, even in this quiet devastation, Henry's plan met pockets of resentment. Peasants who had once enjoyed free grange lands now complained of enclosure and increased rents from new lay landlords. Local officials worried that the redistribution of former monastic lands to court favourites would sow discord and diminish loyalty. Whispers of unrest drifted like autumn leaves. "They have stolen our church," said one farmer, as he watched hired hands burn records in a cloud of acrid smoke. By 1541, the campaign reached its inexorable conclusion. Abbeys large and small lay emptied, their opulence repurposed for royal ceremonies and sumptuous palaces. The religious orders that had preserved literacy and learning for generations were left in tatters. Only a handful of cathedrals and collegiate churches remained intact, their cathedral chapters recast as secular foundations beholden to the crown. What had once been the bulwark of medieval spirituality was transformed into ruinous relics, destined to decay or become picturesque curiosities for future antiquarians. In the hush following this storm, the dissolution's legacy endured. The ghostly outlines of abbey walls stood as silent witnesses to a vanished era. Tourists in later centuries, strolling among moss-covered ruins, might have felt a certain romantic melancholy, but they could scarcely grasp the full measure of the suffering it cost. Those empty cloisters and dismantled scriptoriums represented not only lost architecture, but the uprooting of a way of life. A tidy, unhurried rhythm of devotion, education, and charity abruptly shattered for the gleam of coin. Thus we come to the fourth of Henry's most repulsive deeds. A campaign waged not with bloodlust on a battlefield, but with the quiet authority of a royal decree that toppled the spiritual and economic pillars of a nation. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those stone arches collapsing in silence, the scrolls and chalices slipping from trembling hands, and the soft sobbing of monks laid bare by royal avarice. In that stillness, feel the weight of a kingdom remade by greed, and the echoing vacancy left in its wake by the fall of 1,000 sacred halls. The most repulsive thing, number 5. The tragic fates of the 6 Tudor wives. In the soft, drowsy whisper of Tudor England's candlelit courts, we come now to the sorrowful saga of King Henry VIII's 6 marriages, each a twist of fate, each a testament to ambition, and each repulsive in its own cruel way. Let us recline in comfort and drift through the years, tracing the destinies of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, as they were swept aside, one, by the merciless will of a monarch incapable of contentment. First was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, wed to Henry for 23 years. Their union began with hope and devotion, producing a daughter, Mary, and surviving countless miscarriages. Yet as the years lulled forward, Henry's obsession with a male heir grew feverish. By 1528, his affections had cooled, and he cited Catherine's failure to produce a living son as grounds for annulment. He petitioned Rome relentlessly, only to be denied by Pope Clement. Frustrated, Henry embarked on the audacious path of schism. Divorcing Catherine would not merely free him to marry Anne Boleyn, but shatter England's ties with the papacy. Catherine was stripped of her title, confined to Kimbolton Castle, and left to endure the humiliations of a queen deposed. In her lonely chamber, she spent her final years in quiet dignity, but beneath that calm lay the residue of heartbreak and public shame. The precedent set by her dismissal echoed with cruelty. A devoted wife abandoned for political expediency, her honour subjected to scorn. Next emerged Anne Boleyn, once a lady in waiting, and then a symbol of reform. Hypnotized by her wit and intellect, Henry broke with Rome to wed her. Anne's coronation in 1531 marked the birth of the Church of England. She bore Elizabeth I, a daughter who would one day reign supremely but no son. Anne's time as queen proved too brief. By 1533, rumours swirled of her alleged infidelity. Charged with adultery, incest and high treason, she was brought to a show trial intended to defame her. In the grey dawn of May 15th, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold at the Tower Green. At her side stood Chapiers, the Spanish ambassador, whose letters would later describe the scene in heart-wrenching detail. Her final prayer, the blade's swift descent, and the hush that followed. Anne's execution underscored the capriciousness of Henry's desire at the flick of a sceptre, a devoted wife transformed into a traitor whose blood stained the cobbles. The third of Henry's fateful marriages was to Jane Seymour, whose gentle kindness softened the king's turbulent spirit. Jane gave Henry his longed-for male heir, Edward, born in 1534. Yet the joy proved fleeting. Complications from childbirth claimed her life mere days later. In the quiet gloom of Hampton Court, Jane's funeral service was conducted with solemnity, her body laid to rest beside her mother-in-law. Henry mourned deeply, proclaiming Jane his true wife, in a rare display of affection. And yet, even this deepest sorrow offered no cure for his restless ambition, for he soon sought another bride. Jane's death marked both a fleeting victory, the birth of an heir, and a tragic reminder of the human cost borne by those who shared Henry's bed. Number 4 was Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose portrait had captured Henry's fancy. In 1539, the marriage was arranged to strengthen alliances with Protestant Germany. Yet when Anne arrived, Henry allegedly found her appearance disappointing, not as lovely as her painting, he is said to have declared. Rather than endure a loveless union, Anne astutely agreed to an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation. Unlike her predecessors, she left court in relative comfort, granted generous estates and the title King's beloved sister. Living peacefully in Richmond and Derby, she outlived Henry by years, hosting him for cordial visits. Her pragmatic handling of rejections spared her disgrace, though the episode revealed the callous bargain of royal marriage, beauty, and alliance weighed over fidelity and love. The 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was scarcely 16 when she wed the aging king, bringing a brief bloom of youth into Henry's court. Yet her reckless past affairs and flirtations prior to the wedding caught up with her. In 1541 she was arrested for treason, accused of adultery with Thomas Culpeper. Stripped of her title, she was confined in the Tower, awaiting trial. Atop the scaffold on a chilly winter's morn, Catherine faced her execution with tears and sobs. Her death, echoing that of Anne Boleyn, demonstrated anew that Henry would brook no rival to his affections and immoral standard, enforced with lethal severity. Finally came Catherine Parr, a widow of gentle character and scholarly bent, who married Henry in 1543. She nursed him through illness and temper, serving as a regent in his absence. Catherine's reforms included the publication of books and support for the Reformation. Remarkably, she outlived Henry, deeply affecting the royal children's upbringing and securing Edward's succession. After Henry's death in 1549, she married again, but died soon after childbirth. Catherine Parr's survival and influence stand as a rare triumph, yet even she could not escape the spectre of loss, her life marked by childbirth's deadly hazards. These 6 unions, each a chapter in Tudor England's maelstrom of power and faith, reveal a grim pattern. Personal attachments sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. Henry's relentless pursuit of a male heir, entwined with his desire for absolute authority over church and state, rendering each queen a pawn in his grander scheme. From Catherine of Aragon's dignified exile to Anne Boleyn's tragic fall, from Jane Seymour's fleeting joy to Anne of Cleves's pragmatic divorce, from Catherine Howard's fatal indiscretions to Catherine Parr's brief reprieve, each story is a thread in a tapestry of marital manipulation. As your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the echo of footsteps in empty corridors, the rustle of royal robes swirling in candlelit halls, and the soft weeping of women who entered marriage with hope and left with betrayal. In these 6 tragic fates, we witness Henry VIII's repulsive mastery of heartbreak and statecraft, ensuring his legacy would be as bloody as it was grand. Let these tales of Tudor sorrow lull you into a reflective slumber, haunted by the memory of 6 queens lost to a king's insatiable will. The most repulsive thing, number 6, the trial and execution of Thomas Cromwell, the hidden architect of the Tudor court. In the muted hush of a pre-dawn Tudor morning, let your mind drift back to the year 1539, when Thomas Cromwell, once King Henry VIII's closest confidant and the secret architect behind England's seismic religious and governmental reforms, found himself ensnared by the very machinery he had so masterfully constructed. Born to modest parents, Cromwell rose from apprentice lawyer to merchant, diplomat, and finally principal secretary to the king. His rise was fueled by unrivaled political acumen. He drafted the Act of Supremacy, orchestrated the dissolution of the monasteries, and restructured the royal council's inner workings. Yet those very triumphs would become the noose around his neck. For years, Cromwell's council had steered Henry through turbulent waters, breaking from Rome, consolidating ecclesiastical wealth, and forging alliances abroad. In 1539, tasked with securing a Protestant alliance, Cromwell negotiated Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a liaison intended to bind England to German reformers against Catholic powers. Initially hailed as a diplomatic triumph, the union soon unravelled when the king, upon meeting Anne, allegedly quipped that she bore no likeness to her portrait. Henry's disappointment burned like acid. The alliance remained, but the marriage was annulled, and Anne departed with princely grace. Cromwell's political gamble, once a feather in his cap, now gleamed with disastrous folly. Court gossip swirled like mist in the palace corridors. Whispers of Cromwell's irreparable error reached Henry's ears, fueling his ire. In Tudor England, the slightest misstep or the perception of one could prove fatal. Without ceremony, Henry wielded his authority in shadows. On a grey, wind-whispered dawn, royal agents arrested Cromwell at Hampton Court. He was led away in silence, his star fallen, his power dissolved by a king's capricious whim. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, Cromwell awaited trial in the dreaded Star Chamber, a court as secretive as it was ruthless. There, amid wax candles dripping onto stone floors, Cromwell faced charges of compassing and imagining the king's death, and advising unlawful alliances, charges vague enough to encompass any perceived betrayal. Witnesses, likely coerced, recited half-truths and insinuations. Personal letters were twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Cromwell, ever dignified, protested his innocence, enumerating his decades of service and the tangible reforms he had delivered. But in a realm where royal displeasure equated to guilt, his defence fell on deaf ears. On the 28th of July, 1540, Cromwell ascended the scaffold at Tower Hill, an ironic reversal for the man who had so often directed others to death. Denied the sword's mercy reserved for nobility, he faced the common executioner's axe instead. Eyewitnesses describe his final moments. He knelt, recited a brief prayer for his soul, and accepted the block with unwavering composure. Then, in a single, merciful stroke, his head fell. The principal architect of Tudor absolutism lay dead in the dust. News of Cromwell's execution rippled across England like shockwaves. Politicians once reliant on his guidance groped in the dark for direction. The council rooms he had carefully reformed slipped back into factional chaos. Policies he had championed on church structure, financial reforms, and legal centralization stalled as new favorites jockeyed for influence, some dismantling his work entirely. The dissolution of the monasteries ground to a slower pace. Bishops once appointed by his hand now found their positions in jeopardy. The act of supremacy lost the momentum he had so forcefully imparted. Yet Cromwell's legacy endured in invisible ink on England's institutional DNA. The council's reorganisation he forged remained the blueprint for future administrations. The Church of England's national structure still bore the shape he had moulded, even if later tweaks masked his direct influence. Legal reforms commissions, revenue courts, and administrative procedures continued to operate on principles Cromwell had codified. Scholars in cloistered libraries whispered that he had been the true engine behind Henry's most enduring achievements, a truth as chilling as it was ironic. In the silent aftermath, memories of Cromwell's execution mingled with stories of his fall. Some regarded him as a victim of Henry's unpredictability, a lesson in the peril of absolute power. Others viewed his death as a warning. No servant, however brilliant, could stand when the king sickened of their counsel. The scaffolding at Tower Hill became a grim monument, not only to Cromwell's mortal end, but to the capricious cruelty of a sovereign who dismantled allies as readily as monasteries. Imagine now the hush that followed his passing. The castle gates closing on chambers once filled with Cromwell's confident footsteps, the ink drying on treaties he had authored, the rustle of previously opened coffers now locked tight. In that stillness, feel the unnerving emptiness of governance stripped of its master builder. Let your lids grow heavy with the realization that in Tudor England, the mightiest architect of statecraft could be felled by the smallest miscalculation. Thus concludes the 6th Repulsive episode in our chronicling of Henry VIII's darkest deeds. The trial and execution of Thomas Cromwell, the hidden architect whose rise and fall illuminates the lethal intersection of ambition, loyalty, and royal wrath. As you drift towards slumber, Let the echo of Cromwell's final prayer linger in your thoughts, a poignant reminder that in the game of crowns, service and sacrifice often end at the block. The most repulsive thing, number 7. The tragic end of the Duchess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, and her fatal sentence. In the soft, drowsy whisper of an overcast morning in 1538, let your thoughts drift gently to the Tower of London, where Margaret Pole, the Duchess of Salisbury, faced her darkest hour. Born in 1473 into the illustrious Plantagenet line, daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, and niece of King Edward IV, Margaret possessed a pedigree as ancient as the stones beneath her feet. Under Queen Mary's brief reign, she had stood proudly among England's highest nobility, her manor alive with learned scholars, gentle music, and devout prayer. Yet by the dawn of Henry VIII's dominance, her royal blood would mark her as a threat rather than a treasure. At first, Henry saw Margaret as an ally. Her loyalty bolstered by her position at court, and her lineage lent legitimacy to his newly forged dynasty. The Duchess moved gracefully through palace corridors, dispensing counsel and patronage, her reputation unblemished. But when the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in 1536, a mass uprising in northern England over religious reforms and the dissolution of monasteries, Margaret's name surfaced in rumours. She had not ridden at the rebellion's head, nor raised a banner in defiance. Still, the crown's spies whispered that her sympathies lay with the insurgents. Added to that was her son Reginald Pole, a vocal adversary of Henry who lived in exile, championing papal authority and denouncing the king's severance from Rome. In the Tudor mind, such connections spelled treason. Thus, on a dusk-shrouded evening in 1538, Margaret was summoned to stand before royal officers. Without warning or ceremony, she and her eldest son Geoffrey were conveyed from Hertfordshire to the Tower. Stone walls closed around her beloved halls, replaced by the echo of footsteps on damp flagstones. At 65 years of age, frail but unbowed, she found herself confined in a cell where the air hung cold with the breath of countless prisoners before her. Yet even in the gloom, the Duchess clung to her composure, reciting prayers in Latin, drawing solace from verses she had gleaned as a girl raised in the royal nursery. For nearly 2 years, Margaret remained behind those impenetrable walls, hearing distant bells toll, and knowing that each peal marked another month of captivity. She wrote letters to friends still at court, pleading her innocence and affirming her loyalty to the king. Sometimes, she received faint replies smuggled through sympathetic guards, urging patience and trust in justice. But as Henry's resolve hardened and his paranoia spread deeper into the realm, no reprieve emerged. The Tower, once a fortress and symbol of royal power, had become Margaret's silent witness to an unravelling fate. Early on the 27th of May in 1541, Margaret was dragged from her cell to face a hastily convened military tribunal. The charges levelled against her were startlingly vague, compassing high treason, aiding and abetting rebels, and imagining the king's blood. No tangible evidence of conspiratorial acts was presented, no documents, no sworn testimonies of plot. Yet the accusation carried the weight of royal command. Even as her infirm body shook with illness, the Duchess refused to renounce her name or express contrition for crimes she had not committed. Witnesses recall her voice, though frail, remained dignified as she petitioned for mercy, her eyes brimming with quiet indignation. No mercy, however, was forthcoming. In Tudor England, mere implication could suffice for a traitor's sentence. Orders came down that Margaret Pole was to die, as example to all who might question Henry's supremacy. On the morning of her execution, on Tower Green, a pall of grey lingered in the air. The headsman's block, newly oiled, glistened in the dim light. Noble and commoner alike lined the walls of the White Tower courtyard, some weeping into handkerchiefs, others standing grimly, bracing for the spectacle. Margaret, clad in a mourning gown she had sewn in her cell, was led forward. Her step faltered only once, as though the weight of her 70 years pressed upon her. Yet she lifted her chin with resolve befitting her rank. The executioner advanced. Tradition held that nobility received the sword swift, clean, dignified, but in a final indignity, Margaret was denied this courtesy. The first blow fell and glanced off her neck, sending a spray of crimson onto her silken sleeve. Whispers rose among the crowd. Shameful cruelty. A second strike came, even more savage, yet still failed to separate head from body. Finally, on the third, brutal cut, the Duchess's life flowed out. Her body slumped, eyes closed in eternal rest. A cry rose as the realization hit. England had witnessed the bloody end of one of its highest-born women. Not for actions she had taken, but for the accident of her birth. In the days that followed, the Duchess's absence echoed through court and countryside. Her grand residence at Bisham Abbey lay empty, guest chambers and council rooms silent. Estates once managed by her stewardship passed to royal favourites, as if to erase her memory entirely. Yet talk persisted in hushed whispers that Henry had overreached, that even his iron will had proved too savage when turned on a woman of Margaret Pole's station. Across England, in parishes and manors, people spoke of the fallen Duchess with sorrow, recalling her generosity and piety, and lamenting that her lineage, a living link to a bygone era, had been erased by Tudor ruthlessness. Margaret Pole's fate became a cautionary tale. No loyalty, no service, no noble birth could protect one from the capricious fury of the king. Her death served as one of the most repulsive examples of Henry VIII's no-exceptions policy, the readiness to eliminate any perceived threat, however remote or imaginary. In the hush of night, when the stones of the Tower of London settle into silence, one might almost hear the Duchess's gentle prayer lingering in the corridors, a soft, defiant echo against the roar of royal ambition. And so, as your eyes grow heavy and the hush of sleep beckons, reflect on the tragic end of the Duchess of Salisbury. In Margaret Pole's final moments, we glimpse the dark heart of a reign that prized power above all else, even compassion. Let the memory of her loyal dignity and her gruesome fate drift through your dreams, a solemn reminder that in Tudor England, no life was sacred when set against the king's unyielding will. The most repulsive thing, number 8. The Pilgrimage of Grace, Northern Triumph, a trap cloaked in clemency. In the soft, drowsy haze of an autumn dawn in 1536, let your thoughts wander across the windswept moors of Yorkshire, where tens of thousands of souls first gathered under the banner of the Pilgrimage of Grace. This grand uprising, named in hopeful reverence of divine mercy, became the largest popular revolt in Tudor England, a desperate plea against King Henry VIII's religious reforms and his voracious seizure of monastic wealth. From Lincolnshire's flat plains to the rolling highlands of the East Riding, farmers plucked spades from their fields, monks abandoned cloisters, disbanded soldiers strapped on plate and greaves, all rallying to defend the ancient Catholic faith and demand reversal of the Act of Supremacy and the dissolution of the monasteries. As dawn's grey light crept through misty valleys, the rebel host, led by the devout Robert Arskey, a gentle Lincolnshire lawyer whose faith burned bright, marched under flags bearing the 5 wounds of Christ. Their petitions, penned on stiff parchment and sealed with wax, called for restoration of papal authority, reinstatement of displaced bishops, and the return of monastery lands to charitable use. Each plea was spoken not in anger, but in measured, sorrowful tones, voices raised in hymns, punctuated by prayerful hymns rather than battle cries. The pilgrims professed loyalty to the king, singing of God and the King, even as they chanted against his policies, their hearts heavy with conviction that they served both crown and creed. News of this vast communion of faith and protest reached the court at Westminster like a distant tolling bell, ominous, portentous. Henry, accustomed to crushing lesser rebellions without pause, paused for once. The sheer scale of participation, the unity of social classes from landlords to labourers, the sight of monks who once tended altars now brandishing muskets, gave the king an unaccustomed moment of doubt. Instead of mustering armies to suppress them, he sent envoys to parley. These emissaries, robes trailing, faces solemn travelled northward to meet Aske beneath an oak at Doncaster. There, amidst autumn leaves drifting like silent witnesses, they offered the promise of consideration and amnesty. They spoke of reviewing the contested statutes, of freeing the monastery funds for benefit of the realm, entreating that the pilgrims disband and return to hearth and home. Trusting in royal word, Aske persuaded his followers to lay down axes and pikes. Men turned slowly from banners to landscapes they called home, folding their standard cloths with hopeful care. Women, too, tucked stirring prayers into aprons, believing their loved ones would soon see justice. The fields that had borne the footprints of pilgrimage returned to pastoral calm. Sheep grazed once more on quiet hillsides, and villages resumed their familiar rhythms. All seemed righted by the king's pledge until the trap snapped shut. Within weeks of the nobles' surrender, Henry's court unleashed a wave of retribution so swift and cruel it stunned the realm. Agents of the crown swept through northern markets and hamlets, arresting men who had believed themselves pardoned. Lawyers, priests, blacksmiths, none was spared. Among those seized were men of gentle birth, touched by Aske's counsel and misled by the promise of safety. Trials were held in candlelit chambers, often without proper witnesses or defense. Accusations of high treason hung thick as fog. Imagining the king's death, inciting rebellion, aiding foreign popes. Verdicts followed as if pre-written, and sentences were pronounced on the spot. Public executions became grim spectacles. In York's ancient square, scaffold timbers were raised against the pale sky. Dozens of condemned rebels, once bold in their faith, now stood shivering before the crowds. The executioner's block, darkened by age, awaited its grim proofs. One by one, men knelt to cross themselves, their final prayers barely rising above the hush. The axe fell over and over, reaping both noble and commoner alike. At Hull, a similar scene. Sorrowful wives clutched children as screams echoed, the metallic tang of blood thickening the autumn air. By the time the final head rolled at Pontefract, hundreds lay dead, and many more were shackled and sent south as living warnings. The net effect was devastating. Where once abbey bells had rung for charity and communion, silence now reigned. Monasteries, already hollowed by dissolution, were further stripped of any remaining goodwill. The people's faith in the king's mercy shattered like a sunbeam on stone. Pastoral communities, once cohesive under monastic patronage, frayed at the edges as survivors buried their dead and counted losses. Local economies stumbled, for pilgrim trade and monastic charity had underpinned village life. Schools that monks had run fell silent. Hospitals closed their doors, and paupers found no alms at the doorways that once offered refuge. In courts, far from the north, Henry's advisers editorialized the pilgrimage's suppression as a necessary display of royal resolve. They touted it as a lesson. Opposition carried fatal cost. Future conspiracies whispered in shadowed corners, hesitant to risk Henry's vengeance. Yet, beneath this veneer of triumph, a deep rot took hold. The king's vow to protect his subjects central to the divine right, he claimed, was exposed as a hollow promise. The North's betrayal became legend, a tale mothers told sleeping children to caution them against trusting crown-made covenants. As the fiery leaves of that doomed autumn faded, the pilgrimage's legacy lingered like an aftertaste of betrayal. The Pilgrimage of Grace remained the eighth most repulsive act of Henry's reign, a daring demonstration of faith turned tragic by cunning courtcraft. In the hush of creeping twilight, when the wind moaned through ruined cloisters and empty nave aisles, the silent ghosts of pilgrims could almost be heard, lamenting their faith and their folly. So let your eyelids grow heavy with remorse and remembrance. Imagine the lowering of flags and the fall of village laughter, the craven hush after broken promises, and the echo of dying prayers beneath the gallows. In that somnolent sorrow, we glimpsed the dark heart of a king's strategy. Mercy as a lure and clemency as a cage. Each promise a thread that bound the faithful to their doom. Allow these murmured echoes to escort you into dream's gentle embrace, haunted by the memory of the North's greatest betrayal and the cost of misplaced trust. The most repulsive thing, number 9. Law of forfeiture and exploiting treason charges. The Tudor, Golden Land's ploy. In the soft, drowsy echo of midnight's hush, allow your thoughts to wander to the dusty corridors of Tudor justice, where King Henry VIII perfected one of his most repulsive stratagems, weaponizing the law of forfeiture to seize the lands and riches of any soul accused of treason. Known as the law of forfeiture, this principle declared that when a nobleman or commoner was convicted of treason, every parcel of land, every chest of jewels, and every shred of inheritance passed directly to the crown. In effect, one whispered accusation could pluck estates from under the feet of hapless victims, filling the royal coffers with golden lands at the slightest taint of disloyalty. Henry's court discovered early on that the mere threat of treason charges offered a potent tool. Financial records from the Treasurer's Office reveal that after 1528, the year the king sought to divorce Catherine of Aragon, revenue from forfeited estates rose markedly. No formal proof of conspiracy or sedition was required. Hearsay, anonymous tips, or a hastily drafted indictment sufficed. A favoured minister, coveting a neighbour's manor, needed only to suggest disloyalty. Within days, royal writs arrived commands to arrest, to impound, and to inventory property. The accused, often bewildered, had little chance to mount a defence. Courts ran by royal commission, witnesses were silenced or intimidated, and juries bent to the king's will. This scheme was applied indiscriminately. Former rebels of the Pilgrimage of Grace saw their cottages and crofts swept into the king's portfolio. Quixotic gentlemen who questioned the act of supremacy found themselves stripped of ancestral farmlands. Even those of the highest-ranked Plantagenet scions like Margaret Pole, Anne Boleyn, and Thomas Cromwell fell prey to this legal snare. Once condemned for treason, their broad acres vanished overnight, crops became crown property, and tenant farmers paid rent neither to their former lord nor to any local authority but to the royal exchequer. As the whispers turned into formal charges, the scale of the plunder grew staggering. Rolls of land grants from 1536 to 1540 reveal the crown's domain expanding by hundreds upon hundreds of square miles. Estates that had sustained noble lineages for generations now funded Henry's lavish banquets, his gilded palaces, and his endless military campaigns. The king's Jacobean treasuries swelled with seized plate, stolen tapestries, and even cherished libraries, their leather-bound tomes carted off for the royal collection or melted down for bullion. Some witnesses claimed to see monks' chalices reappearing as goblets at courtly feasts, glittering under candlelight as though anonymous thieves had never touched them. In hushed rural manors and stony market towns, the news sank in like winter frost. Families who once tilled lands under a kindly local lord now knelt in the dust before royal bailiffs, petitioning for mercy or for a small rent allowance. Yet mercy was scarce. The king's strategy relied on fear. When nobles discovered that a treason accusation might serve as the price of avarice, they too began pondering fateful rumours to rid themselves of rivals. The kingdom's social fabric, once woven with bonds of vassalage and honour, frayed under suspicion. Who could trust a kinsman when that kinsman might be plotting to accuse you first? The dual effect was devastatingly efficient. Politically, any potential challenger, wealthy peers, ambitious knights, or influential clerics recognized that a court gesture could cost them everything. Disputes that might once have led to local negotiation now risked royal intervention. Those who might have mustered armed resistance reconsidered when the alternative was swift, impregnable courts rather than a bloody battlefield. The crown faced no open revolts, only quiet capitulations, as the law of forfeiture instilled a pervasive dread. Economically, the policy financed Henry's boundless extravagance without imposing direct taxes on common subjects. Merchant levies and poor rates were sidelined in favour of voluntary contributions extracted from forfeited noble estates. These seizures underwrote not only lavish feasts but also costly imports of Italian silks, Spanish wines, and Flemish tapestries, luxuries that defined the Tudor court's opulence. Military endeavours in France and Scotland, too, drew on this ill-gotten wealth, as English banners marched with supplies paid for by dispossessed peers. In a sleepy reflection, imagine the hush of a manor at dusk, the fields lying fallow for lack of tenant farmers, the echo of a lonely bell marking vespers for a once proud family chapel now abandoned. Picture the scribe's quill scratching out a will in haste, the solicitor's countenance pale as he nods at a royal decree, the unsuspecting heir grasping at fragments of inheritance now swallowed by crown authority. In the soft lantern glow, the law of forfeiture revealed its full horror. Royal justice as legalized theft, the white hallmarks of legitimacy used to mask what was, in essence, systematic plunder. Thus, in the pantheon of Henry VIII's most repulsive acts, the law of forfeiture stands as number 9, a ruthless ploy to profit from the machinery of treason, a seamless fusion of legal pretext and raw greed. As you drift towards slumber, let your thoughts rest on the silent fields of seized manors and on the fine ironies of a kingdom made richer by its own fear. Picture the king's coffers overflowing with land stolen in name of loyalty, a sombre reminder that when law becomes a weapon, even the lie of justice can yield a bounty of golden lands. Let this cautionary tale linger at the edges of your dream, a soft murmur of warning against the darkest depths of a sovereign's ambition. The most repulsive thing, number 10, the execution of the Carthusian monks. The tragedy of the Knights of Faith. In the soft, drowsy whisper of dawn's first light, let your imagination drift to the austere precincts of the Carthusian monasteries, where men cloaked in simple woolen habits devoted their lives to prayer, silence, and strict asceticism. These monks, known as the Knights of Faith for their unwavering commitment, lived apart from the world in chartreuse solitude, rising at midnight for solitary vigils, fasting steadily, and speaking only at appointed times. Their order was renowned as the strictest within the Roman Church, a testament to the power of discipline and devotion. Yet, in 1535, when King Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, these very men would face a horrifying test of loyalty, one that would end in one of the most repulsive episodes of his reign. Henry's act of supremacy demanded that all clerics in England swear fealty directly to the crown, subordinating papal authority to royal decree. For most parish priests, the oath of supremacy was a bitter pill, but many took it under pressure. However, the Carthusian monks could not reconcile their solemn vows with an oath that broke their sacred allegiance to the Pope. They viewed such a pledge as a betrayal of Christ's universal church. And so, when agents of the crown arrived at the silent doorways of the London Charterhouse, Coventry Charterhouse, and Axbridge Priory, they found brothers whose faith would not be bent. In the pale light of a chilling morning, the superiors of these three houses, Father John Houghton of London, Father Robert Lawrence of Coventry, and Father Augustine Webster of Axbridge, were summoned, arrested, and hauled to London for interrogations. The agents, draped in black cloaks and bearing warrants signed by the king, offered clemency if the monks would swear the oath. They promised pensions and freedom from further persecution. For a moment, it seemed that mercy might temper royal wrath. But the Carthusian fathers, bound by conscience and centuries of tradition, refused to betray the papacy. Their silence was their prayer, their steadfastness, a final sermon. Thus branded as traitors, the three priors were condemned to die by the most gruesome punishment in the statute book, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. In Tudor England, this sentence was reserved for those judged to have committed high treason, the most heinous crime against the sovereign. On a grey morning, in the courtyard of Tyburn, chains rattled as the monks were tied to hurdles, dragged through London's streets to the execution scaffold. Citizens lined the route, eyes wide with shock and reverence, for these men were no common criminals but living icons of spiritual dedication. At the scaffold, in the presence of a silent crowd, the executioner set about his grim work. Father Houghton, the first to face the block, knelt in humble prayer, his lips moving in Latin. The rope stretched his frame, then the executioner dragged him until his limbs expected to break. Finally, at the first swing of the axe, life fled his body. The same fate befell Fathers Lawrence and Webster, each enduring the full terror of the traitor's death in the name of faith. Their blood, shed for refusing an oath, stained the scaffold and the cobbles beneath, a mute testimony to the lengths Henry would go to enforce obedience. The purge did not end with these three. In the months that followed, other Carthusian monks faced similar fates or worse. Some were arrested and thrown into Newgate's dank cells, denied food and medical care until fever claimed them. Others were compelled to watch their brethren fall before their own turn came. Reports speak of monks dying in isolation, their bodies found huddled in corners, the air thick with the scent of decaying straw. Authorities justified these brutal measures as necessary to quell dissent and solidify royal supremacy over ecclesiastical matters. News of these atrocities spread like a sombre hymn through England. Families huddled in candlelit rooms as rumours of the monks' martyrdom reached distant villages. Gentry whispered prayers for the fallen, and clandestine masses commemorated their sacrifice. The monks' unwavering refusal to compromise their sacred vows cast them as heroes in the eyes of many, yet their execution served as a stark warning. No religious commitment, however pure, could rival the demands of the crown. Contemporary observers, from foreign ambassadors to local pamphleteers, expressed horror at the savage punishment meted out to men whose greatest crime was fidelity to conscience. Some described the executions as fit only for wild beasts. decrying the cruelty of the spectacle. Others noted that Henry's reputation suffered abroad, his diplomatic standing tarnished by the perceived sacrilege of spilling monkish blood. But within England, the fear of reprisal stifled any open dissent. Clergy who might have spoken out chose silence. Laity who revered the Carthusians kept grief private. The legend of the fallen monks circulated in whispers, a secret liturgy of sorrow. In the quiet cloisters they once inhabited, the empty cells stood mute. Prayer books lay on stone shelves, dust settling over prayer mats now abandoned. The gardens once tended by contemplative hands grew wild with nettles and ivy. Where monks had sung the divine offices, only the wind's soft lamentation now resounded among hollow aisles. These silent ruins became memorials to faith's endurance and to the cost of absolute power. Thus concludes the 10th and final repulsive chapter of Henry VIII's darkest deeds, the execution of the Carthusian monks, the knights of faith, who paid with their lives for refusing an oath that would betray their spiritual lineage. In the hush of twilight, as you drift towards sleep, picture those three fathers standing firm beneath the axe, hearts united in prayer even as their bodies trembled in mortal fear. Let their sacrifice linger in your dreams, a sorrowful ode to conscience under tyranny, and a solemn reminder that in the deadly struggle between crown and conscience, the crown's power can demand a faith's greatest price. Beyond the executions and brutality, one of the most striking aspects of Henry VIII's cruelty was the way he maneuvered the women he once cherished into inescapable traps. Anne Boleyn's story is a vivid example. From an intelligent, graceful maiden favoured at court, Anne Boleyn became the catalyst for England's break with the Roman Catholic Church. She not only warmed the king's heart, but also became the symbol of the English Reformation. Thanks to her influence, Henry VIII abolished papal authority and established the Church of England under his own headship. All around the kingdom, the tolling of church bells comforted people's hopes for a new faith and a freer spiritual life. Yet in the blink of an eye, love and power can turn on their heads. After 2 years as queen, Anne endured the pains of childbirth without producing a male heir to secure the throne, leaving only the seed of a future queen. The absence of a prince was excuse enough for rival factions at court to whisper falsehoods. Henry, who had once lavished her with sumptuous feasts and candlelit palaces, now quietly turned his back, seeking any pretext to bring her down. The court swiftly fashioned a tight but devious legal mechanism. Anne was accused of adultery, high treason, plotting to murder the king, and even incest with her own brother. These baseless charges rested on the testimony of a few ladies-in-waiting whom Anne had scorned. Those women, perhaps out of envy or fear of the new order, became the witnesses in the Queen's death sentence. By the flickering candlelight of the courtroom, Anne Boleyn faced a meticulously staged trial. Both the attorneys and the judges were among Henry's most loyal, ready to accept any accusation that pleased the throne. The verdict had been prepared in advance, awaiting only Anne's signature to affirm her guilt. Yet she steadfastly refused, fully aware that defiance meant the axe. Early on the 18th of May, 1536, Anne ascended the scaffold at Tower Green. A summer breeze whispered through the ramparts, causing her veil to flutter. She bowed her head, muttered prayers, and awaited the executioner's blade. There were no cries, only the stifling silence of the watching crowd. A single chilling blow severed her breath, and she collapsed, leaving behind a tragic testament to love and power. Not only Anne, but all of Henry VIII's subsequent loves shared similarly precarious fates. Jane Seymour, the only one who bore him a prince, died of postnatal complications, leaving Henry with a hollow grief. Anne of Cleves, the political marriage arranged by Thomas Cromwell, ended in an amicable annulment, but the hasty union, based on a misleading portrait, left a bitter aftertaste. Catherine Howard, the teenage queen, was charged with scandalous affairs and beheaded, her youthful promise turned to sorrow. Each of these queens had once stood at the heart of the court, hailed as First Lady of the Realm, only to be swept up in Henry VIII's storm of triumph and defeat. Now, the once radiant palaces echo only with the wind through empty windows, the scarlet chambers cloaked in the dust of time. Their destinies stand as the bitterest proof of the Tudor court's policy. To love is to risk harm. To be hated is all the more dangerous. Reflecting on this, Henry VIII created a protocol for handling powerful women, praise and indulge them, then wield the law as weapon to eliminate them when they cease to be useful. Beneath the glittering veneer of pageantry and ceremony lay a vast machine of accusations and intrigue, clearing the path to absolute power. When night falls and the candles in the palace gutter down to stubs, the Tudor queens appear as restless spirits lamenting in the dark. Their once proud steps reduced to weary trudges toward the scaffold, their joyous laughter transmuted into forlorn sighs. All ended in the stark white sorrow of personal and political tragedy, as power unchecked crushed love and humanity. Thus, among Henry VIII's roster of cruelties, there lies the bitter tragedy of those women who once basked in the court's glory, only to meet an inescapable fate. In the still noonday dream, listen for history's sigh. Love before the throne is as fragile as mist, and a single false charge can bring the entire world crashing down. Henry VIII was not only a brutal monarch but also a consummate autocrat, wielding authority with an unrelenting grip. He transformed religion into a tool of statecraft, bending spiritual institutions to serve his personal ambitions. The establishment of the Church of England was not merely a means to secure a divorce. It was a calculated move to place the entirety of his realm and the souls of his subjects under his absolute control. Those who refused to submit, whether nuns, monks, or nobles, were instantly marked as direct threats to his throne. In the soft glow of candlelight within Hampton Court's vast chambers, Henry's clerical decrees echoed like a distant chime of inevitability. By proclaiming himself supreme head of the Church of England, he broke centuries of papal authority and effectively merged crown and altar into a single, unassailable institution. This fusion allowed him to dictate doctrine, appoint bishops, and oversee every parish in the kingdom. Even the humblest priest was required to swear an oath of loyalty to the king's spiritual supremacy or face dire consequences. There was no refuge from this new order. Every sermon, every sacrament, functioned as a reminder of royal prerogative. The consequences for non-compliance were swift and merciless. Monastic lands were seized. Abbeys once dedicated to charity and learning were repurposed as royal estates or left to crumble into picturesque ruins. Any monk or nun who dared question the oath of supremacy risked charges of high treason. Even members of the ancient orders, men and women who had devoted their lives to prayer and poverty, found themselves branded as insurrectionists. Some were banished, others imprisoned, and a few were executed in the grisliest fashion. Their deaths meant to warn the wavering and cow the courageous into silent obedience. Nobles fared little better. Henry's court became a labyrinth of suspicion, where a whispered rumour could lead to forfeiture of titles and estates. Peers who had once enjoyed free reign over their lands found themselves at the mercy of royal commissioners, who combed through their documents for any hint of disloyalty. Those deemed insufficiently zealous in supporting the Church of England, or suspected of harbouring Catholic sympathies, were plunged into trials where the outcome was all but predetermined. To oppose the king's spiritual authority was to challenge his temporal power, and such defiance could not be tolerated. Even the lay population felt the weight of Henry's autocracy in daily life. Parish registers, once maintained by clergy under papal guidance, now recorded allegiance to the crown. Festivals honouring saints were suppressed or repurposed to celebrate royal anniversaries. Printed tracts and sermons were vetted for conformity to the king's religious reforms. Dissenting pamphlets were seized and their authors hunted. Ordinary men and women learned quickly that faith tied to the king's will was the only safe devotion. Thus, an entire nation's spiritual life came to revolve around the whims of one man. In the quiet hush before sleep, imagine the toll of this despotic system on countless souls, the whispered prayers of nuns in locked cloisters, the trembling voices of parishioners unsure whether their faith was still legal, and the anxious gazes of nobles watching for royal messengers at dawn. Each day under Henry VIII's rule was a testament to the power of a sovereign who demanded complete control, body, mind, and soul. Through his ruthless manipulation of religion, he secured not only obedience, but also a legacy of fear that would echo long after his reign. And now, as night has fallen and the candles have burned low, we close the chapter on the cold darkness of Tudor history and step into a peaceful realm where only steady breath and the soft whisper of memory remain. The tale of absolute power, of tragedy and betrayal, ultimately serves to remind us of the value of compassion, the respect for human dignity, and the strength of a conscience that cannot be subdued. Let your spirit relax, listen to each slow heartbeat, and watch as every sorrowful image fades like mist dissolving in the dawn breeze. Together we have witnessed heavy footsteps on the road to power, silent tears falling at the scaffold, vows of life and death made without compromise, and the distant peal of bells echoing hope for a freer faith. It all revolves around one enduring message. When power grows unchecked and boundless, it consumes love, honor, and humanity itself. The value we carry forward is our belief in freedom, in conscience, and in each person's capacity to choose. No matter how cruel history may be, there are always shining examples of resilience, souls who refuse to bow, small voices that proudly challenge the darkness. We hold these lessons like a guiding light, so that when night falls again, we will always know to choose the light. Now, close your eyes and feel the cool breeze drifting through the window's crack, bringing with it the scent of drowsiness and the faint promise of morning yet to come. Let the gentle music lull you into deep slumber, where there are no clangs of steel or whispers of courtly intrigue, only peaceful breaths and calm heartbeats. If you have enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss our newest and finest videos, leading you into other captivating true stories of history's winding paths. Thank you for accompanying us. And now, we wish you a restful night and serene, gentle dreams. Sleep well.